Hi, I'm Henning from FlippedNormals, and in today's video, you are going to learn how to use ZBrush for the iPad. This video is for existing ZBrush users, meaning you already know how to use ZBrush and you want to learn how to use the iPad version of it, which is a little bit different. So let's get right into it. The first thing we see when we are opening up ZBrush is we have the home screen right here. Then we have My Sculpts, which is all the sculpts I've done so far. Here you can see a collection of them. We can also just sort by C-tool, projects, or quick saves. We can also go down to ZBrush Central, or we can simply import something all the way in the bottom left right here. Or we can go and make a new sculpt. This is exactly what we're going to be doing now. We are simply going to click on the orange icon, new sculpt, and then we can choose between a 3D mesh right here, or we can go to primitives, or we can go to C-spheres. In my case, I'm going to go to 3D mesh right there, and we are going to be clicking on the Dynamesh sphere 128. You can simply select any one of these as well. We are going to keep this simple, so simply tap on this once. Before we get into how the iPad version actually works, let's talk about some notable differences. The first one is there is no edit mode whatsoever. That is gone. Second off, there is a free and also a paid version. We are using the paid version for this video. Some features are also missing, which we'll talk about at the end, and custom plugins and the interface from desktop also cannot be loaded, which means that you can't really export maps like you're used to using the multimap exporter, for instance. Though Transpose Master and Decimation Master are integrated into ZBrush now, at least for the iPad version. So they're not plugins in that sense. The first thing we are going to be talking about is going to be the Modifier Wheel. The Modifier Wheel is this guy right here. And this is something you're going to be using all the time. When I started with the ZBrush for iPad version, I thought this was a little bit confusing because it's just icons, and some of them kind of make sense. For instance, you have a plus minus. If you were to sculpt now, you can see that kind of sculpts inwards. We can try out some of the other ones. If you go here and we sculpt, it masks it. If you click on the top one, you can see that this is going to be smoothing this, and if we click on the right one, you can see that this opens up a quick menu. But it's still kind of confusing how this works. So to simplify this, we are going to go into the user settings, which is all the way in the top right here. We simply tap on the cog, then we go to UI, and then we simply change the icon set under Modifier Wheel from action icons to key labels. And now you can see that these indeed change from obscure icons to just words. And this is where this makes sense, because instead of these just being arbitrary buttons, these are literally just the Control, Shift, Alt, and the spacebar buttons from the desktop version. So now settling this stuff here makes a lot more sense. If we are holding down the Control key and then just sculpting now, you can see that we are masking. If you're holding down Control and Alt, so you can just drag on top here, we are removing the mask. If you're holding down Shift and Control, you can just drag over them like so. You can see that we can now hide something. If we tap it now, we get this back. And if we hold down the Shift key, we are indeed smoothing, or if you hold down the Control key and drag, we are clearing the mask. So this is exactly the same as on the desktop versions. So once you understand that the keys in the Modifier Wheel are literally just the Alt, Control, Shift, and the spacebar, ZBrush for iPad becomes a lot easier to work with. You're not going to be looking up obscure things online, just figuring out how this works. You can just figure this out since you already know how ZBrush works on desktop. So with the Modifier Wheel out of the way, let's talk about navigation. Navigation is of course different on the iPad compared to the desktop, since we have now the touch interface. So we pan by using 2 fingers and we simply move around like so. We zoom by 2 fingers and then we simply just scale this up and down like so. And as you can see, I can zoom and I can pan at the same time, which is really cool. This is something I find to be quite nice and organic. It takes a little bit of time to get used to, but it's a fairly intuitive way to navigate if you are, once you be getting used to it. And you rotate by putting your finger or the pen outside the model, and you simply rotate around like this. But like on the desktop version, we also can use the Alt key to navigate. We don't have a right mouse button, so that changes things a little bit, but we can hold on the Alt key and the pen, then release Alt, and now you can zoom in like so. And then we simply just navigate around by using the pen outside the model like so. I prefer to do a little bit of both like this, just simply for ergonomic purposes. Whenever I'm using this, it's a little bit more tricky to do. It sounds silly, but if you do this a lot, it requires a bit more energy out of you. So it's a little bit less ergonomic, I find. So I often tend to just use the Alt key here and just navigate like this. This is how I'm using this in ZBrush as well, though you can of course use both to navigate. If you find the rolling to be annoying, meaning you use 2 fingers like this and you can see that it rolls left to right now, you can go under user settings navigation, and then you can disable allow roll gestures. If this is disabled like this, you can see that if we were now try to roll this around like so, this no longer rolls. It just zooms in and out and it pans left to right. Still really cool. And this is how some people would prefer to work. Personally, I enable allow roll gesture. So really nice and easy for navigation. Moving on, let's get started with talking about the bottom bar. This is the bar that we're seeing right here on the bottom. This has a few different features. We have all the brushes to the very left. So this is the standard brush, the clay buildup, and so on and so forth. You cannot customize this menu, but you can add additional toolbars on the bottom. So you can, for instance, change this like so you can have your own toolbar, but you cannot customize this one. This is currently locked, but you do have the most common brushes here. So we can, for instance, change this to clay buildup, and let's just change the disable polyframe, and you can now see that we can just sculpt with the clay buildup, we can sculpt with the standard brush, we can sculpt the clay brushes. So all fairly standard stuff. We have inflate right here. You might not be used to these icons actually, because ZBrush is so hotkey based originally. So BCB for a certain brush and all that. You don't have that here. So here we have the icons instead. So if you are not familiar with them, just spend a bit of time to familiarize yourself with these brushes. To the right, we have the Gizmo. So you can now click the Gizmo. You can just move this up and down like so. You can move this left to right. And this works in the same way as the Gizmo works on desktop, where you have the exact same icons right here. So if you want to center this, you can do that here. You can go home like this. You can rotate stuff around. So we have the exact same options as we have on desktop. One to the right, we have Dynamesh. So Dynamesh is currently on. If you're seeing a little triangle, that means there are more options as well. So if you long press on Dynamesh now, you can see that there are additional settings. So we have resolution here, we have blur, we have project, all the kind of stuff that you know from the desktop version of ZBrush. We can long press here, change the resolution to something far lower, just to make sure Dynamesh is enabled. And like on desktop, we simply control drag like so outside to Dynamesh this object. Just make sure that something has actually changed in the model itself. So you just need to tap this once, and then we can just control drag outside the model like so, and now you can see this works. We can also just double tap to undo this as well. Next up, we have SculptrisPro. SculptrisPro also has a triangle, which means there are more options for it. And these are the same options as you have on desktop. Simply click it once, and now SculptrisPro is active. We can enable polyframe over here to the right, like so. And now you can see that this indeed changes the resolution of this part by simply sculpting over this. So SculptrisPro, really nice and handy. We can disable this right here. Next up, we have Zremesher. Click on the Zremesher icon, and then we get the menu for this. Simply tap on the Zremesher icon, and this is going to Zremesh the model in no time at all. Next up, we have subdivisions. Tap on subdivisions and you get options for this. This is where we have a divide, and you can also go up and down in levels like so. Really handy stuff. The way this is organized is basically from early stage sculpt to late stage sculpt. You're starting off with Dynamesh, which is early stage, then you can add some additional details with SculptrisPro, then you can Zremesh it, and then you can add subdivision levels to this model. So that is the logic of the current interface. Then we have live Boolean as well, so if you want to use Booleans, you can very easily do that. Next up, let's talk about the interface items on the left. The first one is the brushes. This is where we can change the brushes. You can see we have the recent category right here, so we can very easily change this. We can also go under all, and you can see all the brushes. This is more how it works on desktop, and they finally organized this a little bit. So we can go under clay brushes, cloth brushes, growing brushes, and so. And you can hover over one, and you can add two favorites. So you can go under favorites here. You can now see that you indeed have your favorites. Hover over again and remove from favorites. So if you have some brushes you keep using all the time, in this case I use Damn Standard a lot, for instance, you can just add two favorites, and we have this right here. Next up, we have the stroke type. This is where we can simply just change this from dots, drag, rect, freehand, spray stroke, and all of that, same as on desktop. Then we have the alpha. I prefer to use the alpha 06 with my clay brush. You can just go under clay, change this to clay buildup, and then go to alpha and just make sure that this is indeed selected. Then we have texture, and texture is something I don't really use a whole lot because I don't really do a lot of texture painting in ZBrush, but this is where you can add a texture to your brush. And next up, we have Matcaps as well, which are also organized into Matcaps and standard. This might look a little bit different on yours since I'm technically using a beta version of it, but this is where you can just change the matcap of your model. We can just disable the polyframe right here just to be able to see this a bit better. And then we have the color. This is what you are using when you are poly painting. by just changing this, you can see that this changes dramatically what this looks like on the actual model. You can color pick, you can swap colors as well here like so, and you can get the hex value down here. You can also fill the objects if you, for instance, if you want this to be fully green, you can do that, or you can go back here, you can just fill object as well. If you long tap on the color, this also goes between the primary and the secondary color, which is exactly the same as doing this as well. We can just undo this so we don't really have any issues with the colors, so that this is reflective of what color is currently selected. And then we have the settings for the brush, like the size, the focal shift, the C intensity, and so on. So the first one is simply just the RGB intensity. So if this is disabled, you're not going to have any of this. In this case, we can just disable this one. I don't want this since I'm not poly painting at the moment. Then we have the focal shift right below it, like here. And you can just change the focal shift up and down. The way you do this is simply hold down on this, and then you can just move this up and down. Then we have the brush size itself, and this is very handy. This is where we can simply just hold this down and just go up and down like so. So hold and then up and down. You can also tap on it, and now this is active. So this means that you can just tap somewhere else, tap on the model, whatever you want to do. And this is still active since this has been tapped. So you can change your brush size like this as well, or you can change your brush size by holding down 3 fingers and just moving this up and down. You can change your focal shift by going to left and right as well. And then finally, we have the C intensity, which allows us to, well, change the C intensity. And like with the brush size, we can just firmly press on it and then just change this up and down like so. The way I personally prefer to change my brush size is simply by holding down my thumb down here and then just moving this up and down. This is quite intuitive and you get used to this in no time at all. Then we have undo and redo. We can simply tap the top icon to undo, or we can tap the bottom one to redo. If you want to do this gesturally, you can simply use 3 fingers and tap, and that's going to redo, or 2 fingers and tap to undo. So in this case, we're just undoing this, going back to the Dynamesh version we have. And if you want to go forward, you simply use 3 fingers and you tap like so. Next up, let's go to the top left of the interface right here. The first icon is a house, which allows us to go back to the screen that we saw in the very beginning. The next one is save. So if we simply tap this one, this is going to save this. This is by default going to be saving this as a project. We can just call this recording and then hit save. And if you look at the icon for a second, you can also see that this has additional settings. So long press on it, and now you can see we have 3 options. We have save, which is simply saving the model. Then we have save as, that allows you to give it a new name and save it as a new version. Or we have save next, which is an incremental save. We also have user settings as well, which we'll cover in a bit. Then we have the import menu. This is different from the desktop version. We have import and export. Let's cover import first. This is where we can import models into ZBrush. This is where we can do this either via GoC. We can also import a 3D model itself right here, where we have some additional options for this. You can change the format from like my ASCII, GoC, USD. We also have C project and C tools. If you want to load in a C tool, for instance, this is how you do it. You simply select the file you want and you load this in. If you want to load in a texture, you do this in the same way. So click on texture, select the file. If you want to load an alpha, you do the same thing. If you want to load in a brush and a material and a light, you do this in the exact same manner. So you no longer go under the texture menu to import a texture. You do this through this menu. In the same way, you also export stuff using this menu as well. So by going to 3D model, we can also simply export this out right here. We can set a file name for this. We can change the format from OBJ, USD, C tool, and C project. So this is how you will export this as well. So if you want to save this model out for somebody else to use, this is how you're actually doing this. You're just exporting this out as a C tool or a C project. This is how you will do this if you're working in a production and somebody else needs your work. Same thing here. You can export the textures. You can export images, turntables, the alpha, the brush, the floor grid, material, light, and so on. So this is all under one unified export menu right now. Next up, let's talk about this menu to the right, this one right here. The first item is the PBR, which is simply a render like you are used to on desktop. The next one is perspective, enable and disable this one. You can also long press on it to change the focal length like so. We can very easily go between 85 and 18mm lens like that. Simply enable and perspective this by tapping on it. Next up, we have the grid, and by long pressing on this as well, we can also enable and disable additional axes. So I prefer to disable this one. Next up, we have symmetry. My model currently is no longer symmetrical, but if it was, we would be able to sculpt with symmetry. Like with the other ones, we have additional options here as well. So we can change this to radial symmetry. We can enable this on X, Y, and Z if you want to, and just enable and disable symmetry. So very easy to enable and disable symmetry simply by tapping this one. Then we have local symmetry right here. And this is a button you're going to be using a lot, which is frame the mesh. This is just fit, and it simply just allows you to recenter the mesh from wherever you are. Then we have polyframe, and this is obviously quite useful since you can see the wireframe. Long press on it and you can disable the fill so you don't have any color, and long press on line and you can remove the line as well, which means that this is not doing anything at the moment, and just enable fill and line back so that you can easily see both of these ones. Then we have transparency. This is not going to do anything because we don't have subtools at the moment. And then we have ghost, and then we have solo. Again, not going to do anything since we don't have additional subtools, but solo, really nice and handy. Next up, we have the subtool palette. This is a bit different from desktop since here we have a permanent button for this palette. On desktop, this is under the general tools menu, but this is so useful that we have this right here. So we have currently the first subtool. We can double tap on this one to rename it. So we can just start to write something here, just double tap here, and we can call this sphere, whatever you want to do. Just put this here, and then we can just tap somewhere else, and this is now stored. Then we can drag from the right to delete this one. This is not advisable since we only have one at the moment. Then we have some actions at the very top here. The first one is append, so this allows us to append an additional subtool. We can duplicate it by tapping the second one. We can add a folder by tapping the third one here. We can give this folder a name. Again, this is going to be a little bit different since you are on an iPad. So there are just some specific iPad things that are just a little bit different, and we can just move this into the folder by simply long pressing and dragging this. And then we have the last one, which is all actions. So here we have additional actions here, like insert, append, delete, all these kind of options. Really handy stuff. We can copy and paste stuff as well. Then we have additional features down here, which is the same thing as you have on desktop. So we're not going to be covering these in too much depth simply because you already know what these are. A notable exception is that Transpose Master is now under the Subtools palette. And like I mentioned before, this is not a plugin anymore. This is a full feature of ZBrush for iPad. So this is where we have things like split, merge, Boolean, align, all these kind of things. And if you want to project from one subtool to another, you simply go on a project, and we can project right here. Then we have probably the most useful button in all of ZBrush for iPad. That is the palette button, and that is this one right here. If you click on it, you can see that we have all the features in ZBrush right here. And this is essentially replacing the menu that we had up here. So instead of having tool, alpha, brush, this is categorized a little bit better and is fairly nice and intuitive to use. Under tool, we can see that we have our subtool, which is the same thing we had just here with this button as well. So you can see these two are exactly the same, just that the palette has more options. So for instance, we have geometry, and you can see that whenever you go to this, subtool is on top, which is really handy because you use subtools all the time. Anything you're doing in these menus, you're doing to a subtool. So it makes a lot of sense to have this on top. So under geometry, this is where we have subdivisions, exactly the same thing we had in the toolbar as well. We have dynamic subdivisions, edge loop, shadow box, Dynamesh, all these kinds of features that you are used to. I just want to let you know about Modifier Topology as well, which is where you have a lot of the general modeling tools that you're using probably quite often. Then we have some additional features that we're not going to be talking about. We're going to be jumping straight to deformation. And this is where we have additional things like mirror, unify, and the deformation sliders that you are used to from desktop, like smart resim, offset. One I use a lot is contrast. You can find down here. We have noise as well, inflate balloon. So a lot of things that are useful quite often when you're working. Then we have masking as well. This is where we can simply invert the mask like this. Let's actually solo this. It's a little bit easier to see and disable this one. So this is where we can inverse the mask. We can clear the mask as well. So if we don't want this one, we can mask everything and so on, right? Exactly the same stuff as you are already used to. You can also hold in a control key, paint a little bit here, then we can go back to the palette and we can just blur the mask, we can sharpen the mask, shrink the mask, grow the mask, the kind of stuff that you are already familiar with. Visibility, same stuff here. We can hide parts, we can show parts, polygroups, we can make auto groups, which is of course easier to see with this. We can make groups based on UDIMs, groups based on UV islands, and a bunch of additional options as well. We have the morph target, we have poly painting, display properties, and importing, exporting settings as well. The last thing in tool palette is also one really important one. If you tap on the icon here, this is where you can see that you have additional tools. So remember how this is still a tool and these are all tools. So if you were to tap on this one and go to another one here, you can see that this is just a different tool, meaning if you were to save this as a tool, restart ZBrush, whatever you were doing on this one here is now going to be gone. So when you save a tool, this is going to only save this current tool. And if you save as a project, this is going to save the whole thing. So simply tap on these ones here to add additional tools, do whatever you want with them. You can also like copy paste them from here onto the other one here as well. You can just paste this in. And this is fairly similar to how it works on desktop. The difference is that you do have to indeed tap on these parts right here. So if you go back, we can now see that we have additional settings here. So this is where we have settings for the alpha. We have for the brush as well. We can go under draw. We can change all sorts of draw settings. This is the kind of stuff that used to live up here, but no longer does. We can change the light, for instance, so we can move this around like so. This is going to change only the material, not the matte cap itself. We can just disable polyframe like this, and then we can go under material, and this is where we can just change the material like I just mentioned, or we can just use the menu over here as well to change the material. So just go back here and we have just additional settings. Like we can change the stroke, for instance. If you are modifying a brush, making a custom brush, you can very easily do that here as well. You can change the stroke type right here as well. So if you want to change this to freehand or color spray, you can also do that right here. Then we also have Decimation Master. This is also an unexpected spot for it, considering that this is under C plugins on desktop. So Decimation Master lives all the way here, and we can just decimate our model very easily. So that's palettes for you. One thing to note as well, you can also tap on this icon right here to make it go from text to just icons. I prefer to keep this to text because this is just a bit easier to see. I don't personally deal particularly well with just icons. Now, a really cool tip about the palette is you can make custom ones. We can very easily do this by simply just dragging this out like so. And now this is going to change a little bit. This is now floating. So this means you can now go here. You can just move this left to right like so. And then we can just tap on it and this is going to disappear, but it's still here. So we can very easily just go in and just click on this to enable and disable it. And we can add additional ones as well. So if we, for instance, want to go in here and add a palette, we can go in and we can add, for instance, Decimation Master. So if we keep going between, for instance, the tool palette here and Decimation Master, we can very easily do that as well. Long press on it to close the tab. So we can just close this right away, or we can just do this on this one as well. And we can just add a new palette, or we can close the tab and now this disappears. So making custom palettes is very, very handy. Next up, let's talk about this menu all the way to the top right. The first one is the undo slider. So now we don't have too many undos, but we can just go back and forth here just to change the undo history right here. You can also go into a certain point. You can tap on the three buttons right here, and you can click on delete older undo history or delete undo history altogether. So really nice and handy if your iPad is getting sluggish. Then we have the customize menu. This is really useful as well because this is where we can make our own custom quick menu or our own custom menu bar on the bottom or custom toolbar on the bottom. So you can see here I already have my own one, and this is where you can add things like brushes. We can add alphas, textures, and materials. So in this case, you can see that I have some custom brushes that I use a lot and just a few simple materials or matcaps. So we can very easily do this by simply going to one of the existing ones. In this case, we're going to be using Toolbar 2. And then we are simply going to be long pressing on one of the brushes and just dragging this down here. If you want to add multiple brushes at the same time, you can also very easily do that. Simply long press on the brush you want to add, then tap on additional brushes. And now you can see it's added them here. You can see we have 6 brushes, drag them down, and now these are all added. If you want to remove a brush, you can simply long press on a brush, then go down here to the trash, and this disappears. Or you can remove multiple at the same time by long pressing and then dragging it like this and simply just tapping it like so. And this is going to allow you to simply drag them out like so. This is incredibly handy since it allows you to change the materials real fast as well. So if you want to add a custom matte cap down here, we can very easily do that. We can just drag these down like so. We can add a alpha as well to this if you want to quickly go between alpha 06 and like a nice little square alpha. We can also very easily do that as well just by dragging these down here. And now we can very easily just change this around. We can also make our own quick menu as well by tapping on quick menu, and then we can add additional ones as well. You can see here the first one has a lock on it right here, which means that you cannot edit this one. So we can simply just swipe to the right, and then we can add whatever you want to this. If you, for instance, want to add some stuff here from Subtools like group split, you can just drag this over like so. If you want to go into Deformation and you use mirror all the time, you can just do this. So this is a really handy way of simply customizing your interface. You can't really customize the full interface like you can on desktop, but you can do this by adding custom menus. So you could, for instance, here have a quick masking menu right here. You can have another one for Deformation. You can have another one for Subtools. So really nice and handy. Then we simply hit done. And now if you hold on the spacebar here, you can just swipe left to right, and you can see that we now indeed have our own custom menu. Very nice and useful. A really nice tip about the quick menu as well is if you tap on these icons right here, you can go between the right of the screen, the center of the screen, and the left of the screen. And whenever you use the quick menu, it's going to stay in that spot. I personally prefer to have this on the right side. Another thing about the quick menu as well is you need to actually hold down the spacebar for this to be active. Next up, let's talk about some user settings. We can access these in the top right here, and here we have all the settings we need. We are going to be going through a few that are quite handy. The first one is we're going to be talking about simply under input, which is where we are currently at right here. And we have different gestures. So we have 2-finger tap right here. We have 3-finger tap, and we have 4-finger tap. I really like having 2-finger tap to undo and 3-finger tap to redo. This is how ZBrush ships, by the way. I haven't changed this at all. But we can, for instance, change the 4-finger tap to something like solo. So if you were to just 4-finger tap now, you can just do that. I find 4-finger tap to be ergonomically a little bit tricky, so I don't really use this one. But if you want to use 4-finger tap, you can very easily do that. Or if you want 3-finger tap, 2-finger tap to be something different, you can also do that. For instance, one thing you can do is you can set this here to be subdivisions levels up and subdivision levels down. So for instance, we can set higher res and lower res, which is also really handy if you keep doing that all the time. Next, let's go to navigation. And like we mentioned before, this is where you can disable add roll gesture, which allows you to simply not roll this anymore, which might be handy for you. I'm going to keep this enabled because I really like this. You can also change the zoom speed and the rotation speed, but I personally find the defaults here to be great. Next up, let's talk about canvas. This is where you can change the color of your canvas. So we can easily go between some pretty extreme colors here if you want to. I personally just stick to this one here, which is a really dark gray, almost as dark as it gets. We can also enable a gradient as well, like we can on the desktop as well. So we can just change this here. I don't use gradients whatsoever because I find them to be difficult to work with, but also because I find them to be hard on video compression and do a lot of videos. So it just means that it's a little bit harder to actually get nicer videos when we do that. Next, we have File I/O. This is where we can enable and disable quick save. So currently it's set to quick save every 20 minutes. We can also have a restoration as well, meaning if you're gone for more than 1 minute, it's going to save, and how many quick save files you have. This is set to a large amount by default. I just changed this here to something more conservative, so this doesn't destroy the space on my iPad. We can also enable skip quick save history as well, and we can also optimize the files as well. The next section is really important. This is essentially what are we saving as. In this case, we are saving as a C project. This is fine if you know what a C project is, but I personally stick to C tools. So I like to save as C tools simply because they are easier to work with, and there is less drama if you're dealing with a lot of different files. So I prefer to save this as C tools. Then we can change the save action on tap as save, save as, or save next. This simply means if you are clicking on this button right here, what happens. To save, do save as, or do save incrementally. We can also enable and disable undo history. By enabling this means that our C projects are much bigger. I always disable this kind of stuff because the files can just become absolutely massive. Then we have UI. This is where we can enable left-hand mode as well. This is really handy if you are left-handed. That's quite handy. I'm not, so I just disable this one. Then we have thumbnail. This is this guy up here, which can be quite handy. You can also see that you can resize it as well simply by long pressing and dragging. But in this case, you can also disable this one right here simply by clicking on this. And we can do the cam view as well. You can't see the cam view very well because it's hidden behind here. But if we disable it, you can see that there is no cam view. And if we enable it, you can see that there is indeed a cam view. And like in default ZBrush, a lot of people don't know about this, but you can actually go next. So you have different kinds of cam view here. So now it's an actual camera. These are just PSDs. Like there's nothing fancy here. These are just frames stored in a PSD. So There's nothing magical about this. This is simply an image that's being mapped to a specific direction. So we can go back here, and we can just go next until we find the one. So we can just go back here and we can just see which one we prefer. So entirely up to you which one you prefer. In this case, we can just disable the cam view. And the next up, we have the modifier wheel that we have already talked about, but let's go into a little bit more depth. We can change the size of it. This is not really just personal preference. This can also be the size of your iPad as well, because that of course changes. So we can just change the size of this one, and we can also change what the icons look like. By default, they're going to be set to action icons. I far prefer setting this to key labels so I can actually see what they are. So, and this is why I keep referring to them as Control, Shift, Spacebar, and the Alt key. And next up, we have the undo history right down here. This is how many undos can you have in a scene. 10,000 is a lot, and this might slow down your iPad, but if it's totally fine, just keep this active. And that's really for how to use ZBrush on the iPad. Let's quickly talk about some restrictions that are currently in this version of ZBrush. There are no layers whatsoever. There is no C modeler. There is no spotlight. There is no surface noise. And like we mentioned, there are no plugins at all apart from the Transpose Master and Decimation Master that have indeed been brought in as full features of ZBrush. So they are no longer plugins. So yeah, I really hope you enjoyed this video. We are going to be doing a lot more ZBrush for iPad videos. ZBrush is a lot of fun to use on the iPad. It's a phenomenal release. Absolutely massive kudos to Maxon. It's a fun tool to work with, and I really hope you enjoy using it. Let me know what you think about ZBrush for iPad in the comments, and we're looking forward to seeing you in future videos.